Good morning, fifth grade. Today we are in chapter 1, lesson 3, and the lesson title is Hands-On, Model, Fractions, and Decimals. Please turn to page 23 in your math book. Numbers that have digits in the tenths place, hundredths place, and or beyond are called decimals. A decimal point is used to separate the ones place from the tenths place. Okay, I'd like to give you a little visual real quick. Here you can see a place value chart. And in this place value chart, you can see the period that we've been dealing with, the billions period, the millions period, the thousands period, the ones period. And then you can see to the right, right after a decimal point, you can see the decimals period. And here you can see that we add THS to each of our numbers, and it's the tenths place, the hundredths place, the thousandths place, the 10,000ths place, the 100,000ths place, and the millionths place. And each time we represent a decimal, there needs to be a decimal point before the decimal that we write. Here they show us a much smaller version of our place value chart, showing us only the ones and the tenths place. Ones obviously being in the ones period, and the tenths being in the decimals period, right? The decimal point is there in the middle. Today we are going to be focusing on using models to show fractions and then converting those into decimals, okay? So our first instruction is to use a model to show 3/10. Then write it in word form as a decimal. There are 10 columns here, and we are to shade in 3 of those 10 to represent 3/10. Just going to shade in these 3. So we have shaded in 3 columns of the tenths model. The model shows word form 3/10. Right? They're asking us to represent that same thing in word form. And the decimal is 0.3. Okay? That is in the tenths place. That's how we know that, right? So when the number that is in the tenths place, you'd say that number and tenths afterward, 3/10. If it were 5 columns that we shaded in, it would be 5/10. If it were 7 columns that we shaded in, it would be 7/10. And it would go in that particular column. Use a model to show 9/100ths. Then write it in word form and as a decimal. So the first thing, we have 100 squares here, and we are going to shade in only 9 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so I've shaded in 9 of the small squares on the hundredths model. The model shows in word form 9/100ths. In decimal form, it shows 0.09 because that second box is the hundredths place. If you look over here, this first box after the decimal is the tenths place. We do not have 9/10. We have 9/100ths, so it needs to go in the hundredths place. Use a model to show 9/100ths. Then write it in word form and as a decimal. That's what we've just done. Use a model to show 34/100ths. Then write it in word form and as a decimal. So we are going to shade 34 of the small squares. So that would be 10, 20, 30, and then 4 additional ones. Okay, so we've shaded in 34 of the small squares. If we were to represent that in word form, it would be 34/100ths. Notice that there are 3/10 and 4/100 shaded, right? So there are 3 whole columns, those are 3/10, and 4 little bitty squares, those are the hundredths. The decimal reflects that. 0.3 3/10, as in 3 whole columns, and then 4/100. That is how you would represent 34/100. Let's talk about it. Number 1, the model at the right shows a thousandths cube. What fraction of the model is shaded? Write it as a decimal. So I'm looking at a thousandths cube, right? It's not just 100, it's 110 times deep, okay? So it's out of 1,000, 4 out of 1,000. Now, how would I represent that? I have my decimal place, and I have the first blank, which is tenths. The second blank is hundredths. The third blank is thousandths. My 4 would go here. There are 0 hundredths. There are 0 tenths. We have 4 thousandths. Here's your fraction. Here's your decimal. Number 2, use math tools. Shade the model to show 80 out of 100, 80 hundredths. Then write the fraction in word form and as a decimal. Okay? So I'm going to color out of 100, I'm coloring in 80. Notice that that is equal to 8/10. If these were columns in the tenths model, we would have 8 of these columns colored in. 8/10 is equivalent to 80 hundredths. Okay, so 80 have been colored in, because 8 times 10 is 80, and 20 are left open. What I need to do is represent this fraction that they gave us in both word form and as a decimal. Well, as a decimal, it would be 0.80, right? Because 0, this second place right here is the hundredths place, right? This is the tenths place. 80 out of 100 is represented this way. And remember what I said before. 80 over 100 is equivalent to 8/10. Therefore, the 8 is in the tens place. Notice the same thing is true when we go over here. If these were tenths columns, if these were columns in a tenths model, 8 whole columns are filled in, 8/10. Okay, so that is how we would represent the decimal. In word form, it would be, okay, number 3. Explain why 45 over 100, 45 hundredths, is written as a decimal with a 4 in the tenths place and a 5 in the hundredths place. This is the same as it was here. Because if I have a hundredths model with 45 of the squares shaded in, that means I'm going to have 4 whole columns shaded in. And then in addition to that, 5 small squares. So the reason why the 4 is in the tens place is because 4 full tens columns are part of it, and 5 hundredths squares. 45 hundredths is the same as 4 tenths plus 5 hundredths. Okay, that is the end of your direct instruction for today. Go ahead and turn to page 25 and begin working on your practice. See you soon.